All right, it's another, oh shoot, what day of the week is this? Thursday, and it's Real Monsters yet again. This is SK Barrett, your host. Joining me, as always, the lovely and talented Wes Hobrick. Say hi,
Yeah,
Wes.
the lovely, talented, and stuffed up Wes Hobbrick.
Yeah.
So I apologize if I sound a little nasally tonight.
So if you want to tell Wes to get stuffed, he already is.
Yep.
And joining us this week is the fabulous author Kimber Fountain. Say hi.
Hi. Hello. Hi, guys. So happy to be here. Thank you.
Happy to have you. Now,
Absolutely.
we are going to talk about Galveston. And for probably most of the country and the world, Galveston's kind of just a name you heard, you know, in a country song. What was his name? What was
Ha,
it?
that's a good one. Yeah.
Campbell.
Yep.
I think the
What was his
first
first name?
time that I heard it
Yeah.
was watching some show on the History Channel, and I couldn't remember what it was, but it was people who were finding all these poker chips on Galveston Bay.
Really?
Yeah, and that's where I first heard about it.
When was that?
Oh, probably a good 15 years ago
Okay,
when I
yeah.
watched the show. Yeah, I'm not sure when they were finding them.
There were a couple of different events with that. There were some slot machines that were dumped in the harbor on the northern side of Galveston Islands, and those were recovered sometime in the 1970s. And then the poker chips are from the other side of the island, the south side of the island, where the Balinese room used to be, because oftentimes when the club was raided, they would dump the poker chips and liquor bottles into the Gulf, and so they've been
Oh,
washing that for decades, or
Get
they wash that for decades. I don't think anyone's found one in a long time, but
interesting.
getting rid of the contraband, as it were.
Yeah.
exactly, that was
Interesting.
part of their genius. That was part of their genius.
All
Very
right. So
interesting.
here we go with our start off our weekly palate cleanser, M of the week. Um, her photo is
Aww.
coming right up. I took that outside just before the show, specifically for posting it here in the show.
Aww.
All right. So now, Miss Kimber, would you mind telling us about yourself and your books?
Sure. Well, I'm an author, obviously, here in Galveston Island. I've just hit my 10-year anniversary, actually, of living in Galveston, but I am what I call a dirty Gulf baby. There is a certain portion of the Texas coast where, because of the currents, the silt from the Mississippi washes up right where our shore is, and so
Oh,
a lot of people think it's pollution. It's just silt, you know. But anyway,
right.
so it's a term of endearment, dirty Gulf baby. I grew up just south of here, coming to Galveston a lot. I graduated from the University of Texas at Austin. And after that, I moved to Chicago and always loved that city even before I'd ever even visited there. And I spent close to a decade there and then moved back to Texas, was about to move back to Chicago, actually, and just kind of had this hunch to move to Galveston. It wasn't really, there was no logical reason to move here. And so within a year, I started doing historical tours and started getting obsessed with the history here because for such a small little place and the city was incorporated in 1839, so it's not a very long history, but there's so much history. I call it the Mary Poppins bag of history because it just keeps coming and coming and coming, and even just when you think that you've researched something to death, you find something else that sends you down another rabbit hole. But anyway, and so currently I'm the editor-in-chief of Galveston Monthly magazine here on the islands, and I have released 3 books on Galveston history, all from Arcadia Publishing, the History Press, which is the largest publisher of regional history in the nation. Actually, they do a beautiful job with books. And the first one came out in 2017. It was called the Galveston Seawall Chronicles. And the follow-up was Galveston's Red Light District. Our district here lasted almost 70 years. And then my latest book is called The Macios and the Free State of Galveston. It was released in February of 2020, and we all know what happened the very next month after that. And so it's been kind of an interesting ride, just trying to find other ways to get the word out about this incredible family and their incredible story. So.
Oh yeah. And there's a lot there, and just looking at some of the maps and pictures that I included with this is just beautiful from what I could see.
Well, Galveston itself.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. It's a beautiful place. And we have a thriving ecosystem. We had a real problem back in the 70s with the whole DEET fiasco, if you're familiar with what happened there. Yeah. And so we lost tens of thousands of pelicans and fish and wildlife. But, after, that was rectified, it's just thriving, and there's so much, open land that's protected by nonprofit organizations here on the island. And it's, and then it also has the historic beauty, downtown on the northern side of the island in our Strand district. We have buildings that date back to the 1850s, and that's back when they built things right and built them beautifully. And so
and one of the things I noticed from the pictures, and they'll be coming around in the slideshow from some of the older towns with the older buildings. There's trees. There's trees on the island.
Yes, lots and lots
That
of
was
trees.
completely
Yeah.
unexpected.
Yeah, that wasn't accidental, actually. I just finished an article for the April edition of the magazine about an organization called the WHPA, the Women's Health Protective Association, and they launched a huge campaign after the Great Storm of 1900, and then the building of the seawall, and then the grade was raised as well, and they launched a huge campaign to replant the islands and shipped in tens of thousands of oleanders and oak trees and elm trees and sycamores, and so we have some really old trees here on the island. It's beautiful, and not just palms too, oaks and everything.
Yeah.
It's great. Yeah.
Wow.
It's very lush. Yeah.
It's beautiful. It's a Tremont right there.
Yeah. And
Yeah,
that's
it was.
Mardi Gras Arch in the background as well. That's the only remaining one. There used to be one on every intersection. That's one of the major thoroughfares of our Mardi Gras parades. And so
I did.
Excellent.
So you do Mardi Gras in
we do.
Galveston,
Yes.
not just. It's not just a New Orleans thing.
It's not. No, we
Oh
are.
Lord, no.
We are the third largest celebration in the United States. Interestingly enough, there's a city in Indiana. I don't know which one it is, but they have a huge Mardi Gras celebration. And Galveston is third. It's a huge part of our culture. Yeah.
St. Louis does it too. They
Okay.
they have quite the celebration, but being right on the Mississippi, I think it's a big part of it.
Well, I have
Um,
Cajun roots, so I just love it. It's a perfect melding of my heritage too, and
Oh yeah.
so yeah.
oh, I have those Cajun roots too. I mean, my great grandmother born in Mansura, Louisiana, and raised in New Orleans. So,
Awesome.
All right, let's go. Tell me about
um,
Galveston. It's in
Tell
Texas,
you
I
about Galveston.
understand.
It is. Well, we say that it's near Texas because sometimes
I wondered about that. How Texan does Galveston feel?
it's not Texan at all. That's really the only reason that I'm here, honestly. Like I said, I got out of the state as soon as I could. Nothing against it, really. It's just, it's a lovely place, and I do, appreciate my roots. But Galveston, it's just different. It's a small town. I'm sorry, it's a big city in a small town's body. We have a bustling downtown. We have a huge art scene, live performance, theater, live music. We have dozens of art galleries and an entire arts and cultural district. Plus, the emphasis on history here is really remarkable because we have so much historic architecture remaining, not just residential, but commercial as well. But the city was founded in 1839, and it was founded as an international port of commerce because of the advantageous harbor that runs along the northern edge of the islands, and quickly grew exponentially, really, and then hit a bit of a snag when the Civil War started in 1861, of course, as did the rest of the nation.
Right.
But after we actually recovered. We were one of the fastest recovering cities during restoration, however, and then just took off at lightning speed. The reason that Galveston had such a lock is because we were the closest port to the Midwest and the West by 500 miles. New Orleans is, pretty far. That was the
Oh
next
yeah.
closest port. And so we had the grains of the Midwest and the flour and the cattle of Chicago and all of that coming down, the meat and then everything, all the new discoveries being shipped in from the West, and then of course importing as well. And but our largest really cash crop was cotton, of course, and huge cotton port as well. And so by the late 19th century, Galveston was the second wealthiest city in the nation per capita,
Whoa,
second only to Newport, Rhode Island, and that is
wow.
of
that's
the
saying
Vanderbilt.
something.
Yeah.
See, yeah.
Yeah, and so today, you cruise down Broadway Avenue and you see these huge museums, but those weren't built as museums; those were built as people's homes,
Holy cow,
And
yeah.
there was a huge mansion building contest down Broadway Avenue at one point, and yeah, it was great. And then starting at the turn of the century, after the Great Storm in 1900, and this was really the premise of my first book. A lot of historians, you look at the change, for instance, between mansions and museums, and a lot of historians try to explain that shift in Galveston's economy by using the Great Storm of 1900, saying that after that happened, nothing was left here, but even though it was and still is the deadliest natural disaster in United States history, the people of Galveston just galvanized at an unprecedented level, and there was this theme, and they called it the spirit of the islands, and everyone just kind of pitched in and did their best to recover from this storm, and man, did they. And there was a month after the storm, the port of Galveston shipped out its largest shipment of cotton to date ever than it ever had in the
Wow.
century. Yeah, so and then came the building of the seawall and the grade raising, and we did that, of course, to prevent anything like the Great Storm
So
ever happening
grade
again.
raising. I mean, basically just lifting the town up.
Lifted the town. We elevated the southern half of the island by an average of 13 feet.
Oh,
I
Uh,
have a
that's
uh,
substantial.
I
it
have
is.
a
It's
few
huge.
photos in there of houses on stilts
Oh,
after
exactly.
that.
Yep.
Yeah.
Still considered one of the most monumental feats of civil engineering ever accomplished in the history of the country. It was insane. Yeah, so we built the seawall first, and it was an L shape, and it it ran the southern coast of the island, and then like hooked around in an L on the eastern portion of the islands. And but then you can't just build a seawall, right? Because then the whole city is in a bowl, basically. Like, look what happened with New
Right.
Orleans in the left.
Yep.
Couldn't do that. And so this ingenious company from Germany called Goddard and Bates. They arrived here on the island and developed this it's too much to even explain now, but yeah, so everybody paid to jack their houses up, and they put their houses on stilts, and then fill was dredged from the bottom of the harbor and piped in through these dredges with these huge pipes, and just shot into these grade raising districts. And then there was about 90% water and 10% fill, and they would let it sit there. They would build levees around each district, and the water would drain, and then the silt would remain. And they did it over and over and over and over and over again. And it
Wow.
took 7 years to complete
Wow.
the whole.
Plus, you
Oh,
got a deeper harbor.
Exactly. And that was an icing on the cake, if you will, because we had always wanted to get to the depth of a first class port. We never quite got there, but we always wanted to.
we
Desperate.
had something similar after the Great Flood of 1993 up here, where people were putting their houses on stilts.
We have
But
some areas. I'm up in the Seattle area, and we have some rural areas that still are in flood zones, and many of the houses have been raised up 1 story. And in fact, one of the new schools that's just been rebuilt, the entire school is raised up with
oh
parking
wow,
underneath of it.
oh
So that's a familiar thing to me.
yep,
Nobody's filling it in. It's, I,
nope.
nobody even thought of filling it in.
That is a beautiful old building. I forgot what it was when I was
That
getting
is
that
Bishop's
stuff.
Palace, I believe.
Okay.
It's a different angle that I'm used to seeing them from, but I'm pretty sure that's what it is. That's at 14th and Broadway. That was built by a man named Nicholas Clayton. He was one of our premier architects, and one of the mansions I was telling you about on Broadway Avenue in that mansion building contest. I'm not sure what that photo is.
Now that photo
Is that
is
after?
one. It's one that we'll be getting into a little bit later. It's the women of Storyville
Oh, okay. Okay.
in New Orleans,
I was like, I
and
don't.
I guess we could just sort of get into that now. It seems to me that Galveston had a much less violent reputation than if you were to compare it to Deadwood or Tombstone or um, even Storyville in New Orleans.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that was a calculated effort. That was not something that just happened either. And that was a big
How do you mean
impetus behind.
calculated?
The Macios were at the center of what was called the Free State of Galveston, which was this era of Galveston where vice was basically our economy. We were Las Vegas before Vegas had even thought about being Vegas, and at the center of it were two brothers who had immigrated from Sicily. Their names were Salvatore and Rosario Maceo, affectionately known as Sam and Rose. And they grew up in Palermo, which was on the northern coast of Sicily. And it was also a hotbed
Mm-hmm.
of Sicilian mafia activity. That was one of their headquarters. Like
Mm-hmm.
a lot of the families and the different sectors lived out in the rural areas, but as far as the commercial kind of center of the Sicilian mafia, all of that took place in Palermo. So the Maceo brothers grew up amid a backdrop of extortion and extreme violence and all the things that the
Mm-hmm.
mafia it has as their trademarks, right? And but they were on the opposite end of that. They weren't part of the mafia. They were part of the peasantry and the lower classes who were the ones being victimized constantly
Right.
by the mafia. And so they immigrated along with hundreds of thousands of other Sicilians, or tens of thousands, and through New Orleans. in the early 1900s, 1901. And there were two groups of the Macios actually who came over, and the first in 1901. And they specifically came over to escape that culture that was happening over in Sicily. But unfortunately, when they arrived in New Orleans, they realized that New Orleans was pretty much the same way because of these kind of, it hadn't been the actual members of the mafia defecting to New Orleans. It had been people that were on the run from them, or people who knew about their tactics.
Right.
And so now that they were in a new land with kind of carte blanche, they decided to use those tactics, and then basically formed, the New Orleans Mafia Syndicate eventually. And so the Macios moved westward to Leesville, Louisiana. And then finally, Rose Macio ended up in Galveston in about 1908 or so. And then, so they were fleeing that kind of mindset, that extreme violence. But the thing is that they were visionaries, and they were entrepreneurs, and they were entertainers above anything. And so they also had this kind of very laissez-faire, kind of libertarian view of governments, the same way that the Sicilian mafia had, but just without the violent parts. And so point being, they were willing to defy state and federal regulations as far as gambling and prostitution and illegal liquor during Prohibition and beyond. But they realized that they could do it in a much better way. And they did it basically by spreading the wealth. By the time Galveston was shut down, there were 42 different gambling houses in Galveston, and only 3 of those were owned by the Macios. And so when the Macios made money, everybody made money. And that's really, what distinguished their empire apart from even, other American mafia syndicates. And now they did do business with American mafia, but they also managed to keep the mafia off of Galveston Island all at the same time.
Wow.
So talk about
That's quite
like
a
an
feat.
amazing level of diplomacy. Yeah.
It really is. It kind of reminded me of all the charitable work that Al Capone did, too. Serving soup in soup kitchens and
Sure.
giving away quite a bit of his money. Very interesting.
Yeah.
Well, that's quite an impressive accomplishment for that family.
Yeah, oh, really?
Yeah.
Because
It's
usually,
amazing.
usually you see, oh, we hate how this was done, and then they end up just doing the same shit over again.
Yeah, you're right. That does happen.
Yeah.
That does. But yeah, and again, I don't even know if, obviously it's hard to know if it was even really a conscious thing, if they really knew what they were doing. I'm pretty sure they did, but because they were very innocent about it, after they opened their first gambling club in 1926, which was called the Hollywood Dinner Club. And by the way, the Hollywood was the very first place in the nation where you could get gourmet food, high-end gambling, and high-class entertainment all under one roof. And today, of course, we know that as Las Vegas. But it's
Here's a
it's
picture
very,
of the Hollywood coming up.
okay, cool. Yeah, it's a very little known fact, though, that the Macios actually designed that template that then later in the 1940s was picked up by the American mafia and Bugsy Siegel, and used to make Vegas into what it is today.
Cool.
Yeah.
There's the Hollywood.
So when that club was raided for the first time, Sam released this huge statement about how he was trying to provide the Gulf Coast and Galveston with a premier entertainment destination, and he just couldn't understand why he would be raided, and so that's where he was, though, mentally, like, who cares if it's illegal? It doesn't matter. It's not hurting anyone.
Right.
It's just gambling, and look at how much, money and national fame and recognition, we're garnering from all of this, and not to mention all the oil money from Houston coming down to spend all of their hard-earned wares here.
Yeah.
This is the front of the Balinese room, by the way, this photo
Okay.
that's up right now. That was the Macios, their last and kind of their coup de grace. It was, and speaking of, this is a great segue because the Hollywood Dinner Club had been raided and it was shut down within 2 years of it opening, but it inspired Sam and Rose to invent a raid-proof club. And
Wow.
yeah, in order to do that, they built a 600-foot pier off the seawall over into and
Oh,
across the
there it
Gulf of
is.
Mexico. And at the very end of it, there it is right there. It was a T head. And at the base of the T was the dining room. And then at the top of the T were the gambling rooms at the very back. And so at the front of the Balinese, where you saw that original entrance, there was a little foyer, and the maitre d' or the hostess who was in there, if law enforcement showed up, she had an alarm bell hardwired to a plate in the floor, and they
Hmm.
would step on it, and it would send the alarm bells off at the back of the gambling room. And all of a sudden everybody would just spring into motion, and there were card tables that would be pushed up into the wall like Murphy beds. They would have billiard tables
Hmm.
that they would put an overlay over to make it the craps table, and then they would just lift that overlay off. They had trap doors behind the bars where they could drop the liquor down into the Gulf of Mexico. And it took the agents from the time they crossed the threshold, it took them exactly 3.5 minutes to get to the back
That's a
gambling hall
long
and
walk.
all the time that they needed.
Yeah.
So by the time the Texas Rangers got to the back, everybody would be sipping on soda pop and playing billiards and bridge and so I
Oh,
mean,
we're
it was just
perfect
ingenious.
citizens.
That's
Yeah,
hilarious. That's clever,
yeah,
guys.
very clever, very clever. Yeah, yeah.
Oh.
So. And it worked actually too. By the way, the Balinese room was not raided for 15 years, and it finally was raided with the rest of the island in 1957. But there is speculation that they had to pay off somebody on the inside because mysteriously the alarm bell never rang that night in '57.
Oh,
Whenever it was,
that's
yeah, whenever it was
suspicious.
raided. So yeah, there's a bit of rumor about surrounding that. But Sam and Rose also had already passed away by that point, and they were really they weren't just the patriarchs; they were the foundation, the center of it all, and they were the ones that really that wooed the city, not flamboyantly and not disingenuously. They truly cared for the people of Galveston Island. My favorite story about them is there was a car dealership, this guy who owned a car dealership here, and he was about to go under. And Sam Maceo just so happened to decide one day that every church on the island needed a new car for their pastor. And so not only did he
Hmm.
buy new cars for the pastors of all the churches on the island, but he also, saved that guy from bankruptcy all in one fell swoop.
Holy
So,
cow.
but they
Take
did a
that,
lot of good.
Elvis.
Yeah, right.
Yep.
So,
Great story.
mhm.
So this, I take it the suit and tie people in Dallas and Houston didn't much care for Galveston then. If they kept trying to shut them down and raid them and all this kind of stuff.
Oh, no, no, no. On the contrary,
Oh,
they loved it here. There was the
well,
the
I
rain.
kind of meant official Texas more than.
Oh, official Texas. Well, they certainly didn't mind the envelopes full of cash that got sent up to the state capitol on a pretty regular occasion. But yeah, it actually all came down to one guy. I'll tell you that. If you want to get into, how at this point about how it all was shut down, and everyone because what was Galveston was doing wasn't just good for Galveston; it was good for the whole state as far as economically went, and as far as our reputation
Sure.
and such. And but there was one
Yep.
guy, his name was Will Wilson, and he in the early 50s he was the assistant attorney general of Texas, and during that position he kind of learned the depth of what was going on here. And however, his trepidations about Galveston were not because he was some, moral savior. He was simply convinced that he could use Galveston to catapult his political career. And to understand that,
Oh, so
yeah,
typical.
yeah, you have to look
Politicians
at the
don't
background.
do that.
Yeah. And in the 1950s, we were it was very similar to the Victorian era, where there was kind of this uptick in morality here, for a couple of different reasons. One being that women had to come back home and they didn't want to leave the workforce after World War II. And so there
Hmm.
was a huge campaign launched to kind of, encourage women to go back into the home and be domestic and such, but also because of the Red Scare and communism, that's when we put "In God We Trust" on the money, and we put "Under God" in the Constitution. And so Wilson was kind of capitalizing on this uptick in morality during the 50s, and he thought that if he took down vice in Galveston, that would make him, this moral champion. And and anyway, it worked. And so he was elected. But the thing is, the reason that you can tell that he had no moral misgiving really about what was going on here was that his entire platform was based on the gambling and the liquor. He didn't once say a single word about Galveston's red light district, which at the time was employing over 1,000 girls.
Oh,
Yeah. And
what?
so, yeah, 1,000 girls at a time.
I bet he
Yeah.
was snorting cocaine in the bathroom through all of it.
I wouldn't doubt it. So,
Total
yeah,
projection.
yeah. So he was a mess. But anyway, he ended up, he did get reelected, even though there was a local, or actually a nationwide group that had kind of helped him take down the district eventually. But then they later released a survey that even after the raise of 1957, prostitution hadn't been reduced by half. And gambling hadn't really been reduced at all. It had just gone further underground
Right.
at that point. And but despite that, Wilson was reelected. But he went on to become an assistant attorney general in the administration of one Richard Nixon. And then he was involved in something known as the Sharpstown banking scandal shortly after that. And so let's just say he was not really on the right side of history very often in his career.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm still looking for that instance where abolition laws work.
Oh, prohibition. Oh, yeah.
Prohibition.
But they don't.
They
They
don't.
don't.
Ever,
They don't.
Yeah, they
anywhere.
never do.
Ever,
All,
anywhere.
yeah. All prohibition laws do is they eliminate the supply. They do nothing at all to mitigate the demand. And if there's a demand for something, there's always going to be somebody willing to furnish the supply,
Well,
despite
I
the.
would argue, I would argue there that the supply doesn't even get diminished under
No, it
Probably
those
just it
not.
laws.
just
Yeah.
moves into the hands of criminals.
Well, there you
Yeah,
go. Yeah. The supply routes get restricted, right? But not the
Right.
supply itself.
true.
Yeah, that's very true. That's a good point. Yeah.
And I mean, having grown up in the bar and booze business, I can talk pretty confidently about that topic. Um, so yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
I'm from
there's
Capone
probably
Land,
no
obviously.
region in the country, maybe the world, that doesn't have moonshine stills right now.
Oh yeah. I
Oh, I'm
mean, it's
sure.
a cultural thing, depending upon, how they distill it. For instance, the Polish have a drink where it is potato vodka. They bury it in a glass bottle for a number of years, and then when a son of the local people gets married, they
Yeah.
dig it out and they drink it. S-
Interesting.
That's hilarious.
And depending
Mhm.
upon, we have one
how
of those at the office, and now it's
distill
gonna bug me what the name is. For instance, the I'll look while you guys are talking.
Well, in Texas, believe it or not, prohibition was lifted in 1933, but liquor by the drink remained illegal for another 30 years at least. And even then, you had to be a member of a club. Like you couldn't just go into a bar and get a cocktail until the 1960s or 70s
That's
here in
crazy.
Texas. Yeah, our liquor laws are still outrageous to this day. But so that's another reason why the Macios and the clubs in Galveston were thriving was because liquor by the drink was readily available here. Um, all the
Right.
way through, yeah, the late 1950s. Yeah. So,
Oh, our laws here are plenty absurd too. I mean, for instance, having to collect cash on delivery whenever we drop beer off.
Oh,
oh,
right.
yeah, you told me about
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. Yeah, and
And
yet in
then
Alabama they have drive-through margarita stands.
yep, yep.
But they can't. But they have open container laws, so they have to put a piece of tape over the straw hole so that it's
Oh,
Uh,
not an open container. It's just so silly. But and yet you can just drive up and order a margarita.
I think the
well, Texans were celebrating because we were able to do that during COVID. I don't know if they've lifted it or not. I think they extended it actually, the to-go liquor policy for restaurants. Now that was a huge deal here. Everybody was thrilled.
One
I
of
think
the
the
actual sane things that my state did a few years ago was to get rid of the state liquor stores and allow grocery stores to sell liquor.
Oh, wow, we still have that division here too.
Yeah, it's been
Yeah.
it's been fabulous.
Starka is the name of what I was
Oh,
thinking of. It's brown, partly aged in a whiskey vat, but I think the weirdest law that we have here is that when I'm making a sign or a banner that goes up inside a bar or outside a bar on their wall,
yeah.
I am not allowed by law to put the name of that bar on it.
Why? I'm
They
sorry.
say
I'm sorry. I said why about a government regulation. I should.
Yeah.
it's so stupid. They think that if we add their name to it, it gives them something of value, and that's against the law.
But the sign doesn't have value without.
Apparently not to them.
Oh my
You,
God, the
you
government
have
is run
to
by morons.
realize, yeah, you have to
It
realize
really
most of the
is.
liquor laws up here were written by Capone and the mob.
Yeah, I don't doubt that. So, what about this red light district?
Oh, wow. It was quite a feat. It lasted, like I said, nearly 70 years. Of
And
course, prostitution is nothing new, and it existed in Galveston, even far before the existence of an organized district. But like I said, we were founded as that international port. So
right?
with ships coming and going from all over the world from different places, and carrying different goods, they all had one thing in common, and that was men, right? And so
Yes.
it began this kind of growth of an
Men who had
underground economy
been cramped together at
with
sea for
yeah,
weeks
with
on
cash
end.
to spend and board and yeah, exactly. And so by the 1880s, Galveston was home to 569 taverns and bars, along with 55 different yeah, 55
Wow.
what they called cribs. Now, this is prior to the district model when women were working out of these little one-room shacks or shanties that were
Okay.
called cribs. So in a town that of at that point probably what 20, 30,000 people, there were 55 different of those just scattered throughout the town. But then in the Victorian era, like I kind of touched on a little bit earlier, that ushered in this very rigid sense of propriety and etiquette, especially in regards to women and the expectations for them. And so there was another one of those little upticks in morality, like I mentioned earlier. And so there began this trend in the nation of what was called segregating prostitution, because these towns, the Galveston wasn't an anomaly in this case. All right, this was a pretty common scene in most seaport cities
Sure.
and urban centers in the nation at the time. And so, of course, the word segregation today, refers almost exclusively to race. But this was the late 19th, early 20th centuries, and a segregated district in a town referred specifically to an area where these prostitutes were allowed to operate relatively unfettered. Now, that didn't mean that prostitution was ever legalized. It very rarely was. It was kind of, they were working on a de facto basis. And around the same time that this trend was kind of happening, a certain strip of Post Office Street here in Galveston emerged that provided a perfect situation. Originally, this street had been a pretty elite part of town, and these huge houses had been built along it.
Yeah.
But the cityscape had kind of shifted, and downtown had expanded. And when downtown expanded, they basically moved it like directly in the middle of the residential area, so it fractured the residential zones, and it created this kind of wrong side of the track scenario. And so now all these beautiful houses were kind of thrust over into this area of town that now started to be industrialized, and they started to tear down a lot of the other homes around them and build factories and warehouses and lumber yards and scrap yards and things like that. So that meant that these gorgeous homes along Post Office were now suddenly just worthless as far as real estate value went. And of course, they weren't worthless to the madams, right? These were huge
Sure.
houses with, tons of bedrooms, perfect for their female boarding houses, right? Which is all they were doing.
Reduced prices on the real estate.
Yes, exactly. Super cheap. And so they started to get scooped up, and about 1890 is when it all kind of gelled and came together, and it was given a name, and it was called the Line. And the Line was simple. It was kind of an ubiquitous nickname. It was given to a lot of different districts around the nation, and ours just so happened to be a straight line, one shot down Post Office Street. Although it did grow and expand, starting, of course, with the Free State of Galveston days. And the entrance of Prohibition, which is where all of that started around 1920. And then, of course, it peaked during the Great Depression, and that's when it grew and employed close to 1,000 girls at a time. And then continued, of course, during World War II. We had two large Army bases here on the islands during World War II. And so officially, the district was closed via an order of the United States military, but the back doors were always open, of course. And then in the 1950s, it kind of hit another peak back when the women, again, as I mentioned earlier, who didn't want to lose working income,
Right.
started to do this instead. But in the book was a huge labor of love. It was an awesome journey, because when I started this, I really didn't even know why I was so fascinated by the existence of Galveston's district. I kind of felt a little nuts, like, really, Kimber, prostitutes, like what, I mean, what is your deal? Why are you so obsessed with them? But slowly, as I just kept digging and digging, I finally figured out, what was drawing me to this topic. And it wasn't what was going on, it was why it was happening.
Ah.
And because these women, there was a man who wrote in the 1930s who wrote his master's thesis on Galveston's district, and it was called A Sociological Study of a Segregated District. And he discovered that these women were well-read, they were well-traveled, they were worldly, they were smart, they wanted to own businesses. One of them wanted to be an aviator. She wanted to be a pilot. These women had huge dreams, but they could make more from one guy than they could from an entire day of menial labor that was available to them in the early 20th century. And these were things like sewing and shelling pecans. That was about
Right.
the extent of it. And even in the 1950s, around abouts where employment started to get a little bit better for women, there was still a very distinct ceiling. And it was usually topped out at teacher, nurse, or secretary, and
Right,
that was it. And
exactly.
there was, no upward mobility within those ranks either. And so, I discovered that there was one thing and one thing only that these women wanted, and that was freedom. And oftentimes we throw that word around a little nonchalantly, and we have a tendency, not we here, but some people have a tendency to think that freedom is something that's given to us, and freedom is a birthright. Freedom is something that no matter where you are on this planet, it is something that you're going to yearn for, and it's something that you're going to crave because it's the basis of our existence. And
Hmm.
that's what these women were to me. They knew that they deserved to be free, and they were willing to do the only thing that would give them that freedom. I mean, these women had charge accounts at local department stores. They had clear titles to automobiles. They had cash to spend, and so even though their cage was it was still a cage because of the all of the perils of the job, the disease and the unwanted pregnancy and violence,
Violence, yeah.
like that. Yeah. But it was a much bigger cage than what most women were allowed to operate within during that time. And so that's when, that was that aha moment, for me. I was like, okay, now I get it, because these women weren't trying to be rebels. They weren't trying to, maybe they were trying to buck the system a little bit, but not not if they would have had a better option in which to do so, and
Right.
not surprisingly, it was in the 1960s is when the United States and Galveston both saw a dramatic drop in prostitution and practically a complete elimination of what I call mass prostitution, which is the district model that is comprised typically of the brothel madam system, and that steep drop was, you know, um, not coincidentally due to two huge movements of the 1960s. And the first was the second wave feminist movement, that was specifically geared towards increasing employment opportunities for women and giving them livable wages and upward advancement and mobility and taking the stigma off of women working. But the other one was the sexual revolution, because the sexual revolution not only took a lot of the stigma off of female sexuality, but it also changed the way men, were viewing women as well, where prior to that, it was very culturally sound to reject women or to ostracize them if they were willing to engage with you
Uh,
sexually. We've
right.
all heard those stories, right? Yeah. And so, but the sexual revolution started to tell men, men started to realize, hey, what if it's a lot better that I can actually go and have sex with a consenting peer as opposed to having to go into a brothel and hire a prostitute? Because ironically, that was totally socially acceptable. All of these districts would not have existed if there hadn't have been a demand for their service as well,
Mm-hmm.
Right.
as well as them needing the.
Yep.
So, and that's where that demand came from. And so it was just really a fascinating, when you look at it like that, because, I've studied the feminist movement and the sexual revolution, but never thought that, of that direct impact that it had on, the levels of prostitution in this country. It's really
Well,
kind of,
Kimber, there's a lot of people in this town or in this country, I mean, who aren't taught basic economics.
yeah.
It's
Oh,
sad.
that's a
Very,
fact.
very sad.
One of
Yeah.
the things I was thinking on while you were talking about that is Daniel Pink in his book Drive talks about the number one uh, attribute for job satisfaction is autonomy. And
Wow. Yeah.
yeah, more than money, it's autonomy. It's a sense of control over what you do every day.
I
And
Wow.
believe
that is,
that.
yeah, and that's
That's a
exactly
great
what
point.
these women were after.
You're exactly right. That is a great point. They, like I said, they were, they weren't, we have this kind of image of these women, I think it's easy to digress into that and thinking that they were all, lower class. And, there
Drug
were
addicts and
college
all that
girls
kind of stuff.
working in Galveston's district. They would come here during the summer and they would work for their college tuition. And then they would go back and they would go to college. And the thing about Galveston's district too is that, and also the time frame that we're in and the era and the level of technology. And, one thing that Galveston provided these women was complete anonymity. They could
Mm,
come down here and they could work for however long and then go back from where they came and nobody would know the difference.
right.
They would
The
know
chances
what
of
they
ever
were.
running into anybody who knew them from that life was pretty close to zero.
Exactly, exactly. Not to mention we didn't broadcast our entire lives on the internet like we do today. Yeah, yeah. But it just really it was really eye-opening because of course, I am a proponent of the decriminalization and legalization of prostitution, but to be able to find a story that really fleshed that out in historical context, and
Hmm.
really offered the black and white numbers and the situations and actual firsthand insight into who these women were and what they were trying to do. I mean, it just kind of, not to toot my own horn or anything, but it just blew the lid off this topic for me. It really did because, it's one thing to believe, on a political level in bodily autonomy and things like that, but to actually find this seemingly kind of random little space of history, this little microcosm that just totally elucidates, the philosophies that many people in the United States, I think, are slowly kind of waking up to, and that
Yeah.
is, the issues of victimless crime, whether or not there were no victims in Galveston's red light district. The fact that Galveston went 8 consecutive years without one documented rape case,
Wow.
during the existence of Galveston's district. And what's funny too is even the historical mindsets of the people, the higher ups, if you will, the city officials and even the elite people of Galveston who, basically rubber stamped the approval for its existence, their thought processes were a lot of what we, who are proponents of sex work, kind of think about today. And that is, it's kind of it's a necessary evil. That's what their words were, in that it provided an outlet, for certain men who needed that, that kind of outlet,
Right.
and also it, for instance, in Galveston, a madam could call the cops. Okay, if
Yes.
the guy in her brothel that was beating up one of her girls, she could call the police.
Right.
And that's the kind of thing too today is that, it's been proven, especially with the European models, that violence against sex workers and sex trafficking just plummets whenever there's a larger, broader acceptance of prostitution as a viable occupation for a woman.
Yeah, the ability to call the cops is huge.
Oh my gosh, yeah, yeah. Can you imagine that? That wouldn't happen today. Women can't do that today because they
Right.
will be arrested.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that gives predators just, free reign, because there's almost no accountability for that whatsoever. And that was really what, drew me to this, to that issue as well, was, these women, a lot of them were viewed as subhuman.
Hmm.
There was just this total loss of dignity that came with this profession. And it's part of the reason I wanted to know why women would do this, at such a large scale. But great illustration of that is, whenever a brothel was raided by law enforcement, which would happen not just in Galveston, but everywhere, they never arrested the men. It was only the women who were ever arrested when a brothel was raided. And in Galveston's case, there was one instance where a rookie cop was sent to raid a brothel and he didn't know any better. So he arrested two of the men and that were there. And the mayor himself went to the newspaper and demanded that the paper not print the names of the men. Uh, but yeah, but printed all the ones. So
Yeah.
it's a complex issue, and again, it was really it was a pleasure, and it was a lot of fun to be able to again illuminate this topic from a documented historic perspective. You know, it's a lot, it's really easy to talk about these topics. It's difficult sometimes to talk about these topics in the nebulousness, that is philosophy and political leanings. So it was really neat to be able to frame it.
Hey, Wes. I think we lost Wes.
I think you did too. Did he fall asleep? Did I bore him that
It's
much? Oh
possible.
my gosh.
He's taking some medications. He might have fallen asleep. Hey, buddy. We did a show last year about a serial killer in Galveston.
Oh yeah. What's this guy? I know. Go ahead.
No, I forgot his name.
It was Durst, right? Robert Durst, or is that his name?
That does sound familiar.
Something like that. I
Yeah.
don't know. My fiance is actually a total expert on crime stuff, and he knows all that story. I'm not too apprised on that, but it is. Let me look it up real quick. But yeah, he was crazy. He was well, and there's a really good movie we just watched recently called The Killing Fields that's about kind of that area. Yeah, Robert Durst. Yeah,
Yeah.
that was him. Yeah, crazy. Suspected serial killer, right? They say, but yeah. So yeah, back in the 80s and early 2000s. Wow. So he was quite the character. Definitely worth a look up for anyone who is interested in that. Did you uncover anything super interesting about him?
You know, we've done so many shows, I can't really keep them all
They all kind
straight.
of run together. Yeah.
But yeah, that was kind of my introduction to Galveston was that show.
Uh,
Yeah. Uh, I got to make a trip down there now.
yeah, you
I've never
do.
been, and now I'm quite interested to come visit that part of the country.
Well, Galveston's a neat little niche for sure. It's definitely worth a visit. There's so much here. And again, like you said, the history is just fascinating, and it's like this little, they call it the psychology of isolation. We're just a
Oh,
mere 2 miles from the mainlands, if that. But there's something about that detachment, that really it changes the whole mentality of the people here, and that's speculated as to one of the reasons why the Free State of Galveston, could have lasted 40 years. Was
hmm,
because of that again, that psychology of isolation, this kind of independence, like and it's funny, interestingly, in the Macio's case, the same with it was the same with their native land of Sicily. That was another reason why the mafia was
oh,
yeah,
yeah,
really percolated there, was
right.
because they were kind of cut off and from the rest of the world too. And so anyway, but it's something that's palpable even today.
Yeah,
That you can really just, it just has a totally different energy than the rest of Texas. It's really its little odd bird over here floating out in the water. So,
yeah.
but for anyone who's interested in my books, they are available at booksbykimber.com, and those are signed copies that come directly from me, and
We'll
you
put
can
those
order them
covers up
anywhere.
again.
Yeah,
You can order directly from you.
directly from me, and then there'll be signed copies,
Oh,
and
awesome.
yeah, they're
And
available
the
everywhere.
yeah,
But little hint, authors do a lot better when we can sell our books directly,
that's true.
especially with you know, publisher like that. I think with self-published, it might be a little easier to sell on Amazon, but with
Right.
us, yeah, it's it's good to buy direct, and you'll get them signed.
That's awesome.
That's,
Yeah, a signed
uh,
copy is great. And the 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 URL for your site is in the uh, YouTube description. So if
awesome.
anybody wants to find it, it's right there. And any final thoughts?
I don't think so.
Okay,
This has been an immense pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on. It's been a lot of fun talking to you guys, and thank you for bringing shedding a little light on our little hidden little paradise over here in Texas.
yeah, this has been a treat for us as well.
Yeah,
Really appreciate you coming on and sharing your in-depth knowledge of this great little part of the country.
yeah, you guys are great. Thanks so much for having me, SK.
Thank you for being on. And maybe if you get something else going that you want to talk about, reach out and let us know. We'll have you on
Yeah, I
again.
sure will. I'll also mention real quick before we go, I forgot, I do have a tour as well, actually, an historical tour.
Oh, awesome.
That is, yeah, based off the Red Light District book and the Maceo book, but it is the Red Light District Tours of Galveston. And so just rldtg.com if anyone's ever over in this area wants to see all the buildings up close and personal. It's a pretty fun ride.
Definitely.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you guys so much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Good night.
Good night.